if the press and the media in our country were doing their job, conferences like this would not be necessary. And if there any, yeah. And if my little chat in the next hour doesn't disturb you, you weren't paying attention. And if there's any press here, I challenge them right now to really cover this day's disclosures, check the sources, and then I challenge them to publish the truth about what's going on in our country. You know, for many years, many authors have published writings suggesting that there's a hidden government behind the scenes that actually runs America. Most of us, I think, have dismissed these so-called conspiracy theories as extremist and unrealistic. But as I mentioned yesterday, I had the opportunity some time ago to have lunch with Otto von Habsburg, who was a member of the European Parliament, whose father ruled Europe until the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He's now a member of the European Parliament. And during that lunch, he made two remarks, one that did not surprise me and one that shocked me. He said, the ignorance in America is overwhelming, and I knew what he meant, because I've traveled for 30 years of my corporate career with offices in Europe, and I was always startled at how much the average Europeans know about our local politics and how ignorant we are of even the issues in our own country, let alone have any awareness of the global scene. That was something I had encountered myself, and I understood his remark. But he also made a remark that the concentration of power in America is frightening, and I didn't know what he meant. And I thought, I've served on 12 public boards, I was chairman of 6 of them, and I've put plants in 7 countries. I've spent most of my 30 years as an executive, as I thought, a reasonably well-informed American who has a deep, passionate love for this country of the free enterprise system and our free democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So I had no idea what he was getting at. And I started to do some homework. And the results of my inquiries are disturbing. I'm going to share some of those with you. The Bible says we should not be ignorant of Satan's devices, and that's my excuse to get into some things that I want to call to your attention today. I challenge you to do your homework. I'm hoping you will find what I'm going to talk about, especially in the last half of the hour. I hope you'll find this in the press in the coming months. If not, this country is doomed. But let's back up a little bit. You and I need to have a better understanding of the forces that will shape the coming few years. But let's start back with Andrew Jackson, first president from west of the Appalachians. He was unique in that at the time he was unique because he was elected by the voters without direct support of any political party. And he vetoed the renewal of the charter of the Bank of the United States on July 10th of 1832. By 1835, President Andrew Jackson declared his disdain for the international bankers. Quote, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." Following that speech, there was an assassination attempt on his life. It was unsuccessful, but he mentioned to Martin Van Buren, his vice president, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me." Was this the beginning of a pattern in our country? Would this pattern of intrigue plague the White House itself over the coming decades? Let's move to Abraham Lincoln. He worked valiantly to prevent the attempts of the Rothschilds to involve themselves in financing the Civil War. Quote, Lincoln, "Let me issue and control," first quote I want to give you is from Baron Nathan Rothschild to put this in background. "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." It's interesting that as Lincoln was struggling with the financing of the Civil War, it was the Tsar of Russia that saved the situation. We needed assistance because both the British and the French were among the driving forces behind the secession of the South and her subsequent financing. The Russians intervened by providing naval forces for the Union blockade of the South in European waters, and by letting both countries know, France and Britain, that if they attempted to join the Confederacy with military forces, they would have to go to war with Russia. I think it's interesting to know that footnote on history. But anyway, the Rothschild interests succeeded, however, through their agent, Treasury Secretary Simon P. Chase, to force a bill, the National Banking Act, through Congress, creating a federally chartered central bank that had the power to issue U.S. banknotes. When this happened, Lincoln warned the American people as follows, quote, "The money power that preys upon the nation in time of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than a monarchy, more insolvent than autocracy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of our country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corporation will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." That was Abraham Lincoln. He continued to fight against the central bank, and some now believe that it was his anticipated success in influencing the Congress to limit the life of the Bank of the United States to just the war years that was the motivating factor behind his assassination. Modern researchers have uncovered evidence of a massive conspiracy that links Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to John Wilkes Booth and his 8 conspirators and over 70 government officials and businessmen involved. Not only were they involved in the conspiracy, they have now been linked to the Bank of Rothschild in Europe. When Booth's diary was recovered by Stanton's troops, it was delivered to Stanton. When it was later produced during the investigation, 18 pages had been ripped out. Not 18 seconds off a tape that time, it was just 18 pages ripped out. These pages contained the aforesaid names and were later found in the attic of one of Stanton's descendants. From Booth's trunk, a coded message was found that linked him directly to Judah P. Benjamin, the Civil War campaign manager in the South for the House of Rothschild. When the war ended, the key to the code was found in Benjamin's possession. The assassin was portrayed as a crazed lone gunman. That's where the myth was born. With a few radical friends, he escaped by way of the only bridge in Washington not guarded by Stanton's troops. Quote, Booth, close quote, was located hiding in a farm near Port Royal, Virginia. 3 days after escaping from Washington, he was shot by a soldier named Boston Corbett, who fired without orders. Whether or not the man that was killed was Booth or not is still a matter of conjecture and substantial historical contention, as a matter of fact. It remains that whoever he was that was killed had no chance to identify himself. It was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton who made the final identification. Some now believe that a dupe was used and that the real John Wilkes Booth escaped with Stanton's assistance. It's interesting how this myth of the lone assassin goes through both the Kennedy assassinations, and on it goes. It's always a lone crazed gunman. How interesting it is. Mary Todd Lincoln, upon hearing of her husband's death, began screaming, "Oh, that dreadful house." And earlier historians felt that this was the spontaneous utterance referred to the White House. Some now believe that it may have been directed to Thomas W. House, a gun runner, financier, an agent of the Rothschilds during the Civil War, who was linked to the anti-Lincoln pro-banker interests. Let's move on. President Garfield, our 20th president, previously was chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations and was an expert on fiscal matters. In fact, upon his election, he appointed an unpopular collector of customs in New York, whereupon 2 senators from New York, Roscoe Conkling and Thomas Pratt, resigned their seats. President Garfield openly declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. After only 4 months in office, President Garfield was shot at a railroad station on July 2nd, 1881. What a coincidence. One of the myths that we're going to address here, with which we all live, is this charade that we call the Federal Reserve. It is neither federal nor a reserve. It comes as a shock to many to discover it is not an agency of the United States government. The name Federal Reserve Bank was designed to deceive, and it still does. It is not federal, it is not owned by the government, it is privately owned. It pays its own postage, like any other corporation. Its employees are not in the civil service. Its physical property is held in private deeds and is subject to taxation, which of course government property is not. It is an engine that has created private wealth that is unimaginable, even to the most financially sophisticated. It has enabled an imperial elite to manipulate our economy for its own agenda and has enlisted the government itself as its enforcer. It controls the times, it dictates business, affects our homes, and practically everything in which you and I are interested. And few Americans realize this whole betrayal was plotted on Jekyll Island, Georgia, that was destined to defraud Americans of their wealth, opportunity, and eventually would lead to the subjugation of the great democratic experiment to a centralized world government. The concerns of the leadership of the Federal Reserve and its secretive international benefactors appears to go far beyond just currency and interest rates. In November of 1910, after having consulted with the Rothschild banks in England, France, and Germany, Senator Nelson Aldrich boarded a private train in Hoboken, New Jersey. His destination was Jekyll Island, Georgia, and a private hunting club owned by J.P. Morgan. Aboard the train were 6 other men: Benjamin Strong, president of Morgan's Bankers Trust Company; Charles Norton, president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York; Henry Davidson, senior partner of J.P. Morgan; Frank Vanderlip, president of Kuhn Loeb's National City Bank of New York; A. Piat Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury; and the plotter-in-chief, Paul Warburg. The secret meeting has been described by one of its architects, Frank Vanderlip, president of Kuhn Loeb's National City Bank. Quote, interesting quote: "There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. The goal was to establish a private bank that would control the national currency. The challenge was to slip the scheme by the representatives of the American people. Earlier it had been called the Aldrich Bill and received effective opposition. The devious planners of the revised bill titled it the Federal Reserve Act to mask its real nature. It would create a system controlled by private individuals who would control the nation's issue of money. Furthermore, the Federal Reserve Board, composed of 12 districts and 1 director, the Federal Reserve Chairman, would control the nation's financial resources by controlling the money supply, available credit, and by mortgaging the government through borrowing. By the way, this conspiracy would be unnecessary today because in those days the average voter was sophisticated enough to understand the issues. Today, I doubt that all would be necessary. The conspirators, by the way, had a problem, because President William Howard Taft had made it clear that he would veto such a bill if it was introduced. They had to make sure that he did not win re-election. At first, they supported ex-President Teddy Roosevelt in the Republican primaries, but he failed to get the nomination. Then the bankers supported the Democratic contender Woodrow Wilson. In exchange for their support, Wilson promised to sign their bill into law, but the problem was the polls indicated that Wilson would only draw about 45% of the vote, so the bankers needed someone to draw a sufficient number of Republican votes away from Taft without harming their Democratic candidate. So they arranged for Teddy Roosevelt to run against both men by representing a newly invented third party called the Bull Moose Party. Does that sound familiar? Using Ross Perot to defeat George Bush and get Bill Clinton elected is an example. Now, the one back then was 45%. Clinton won by what? With 43%. Kind of interesting. Interesting tactic. Watch for it again. The plan worked. The Federal Reserve Act was held until December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, when everybody went home on leave, except those that had been bribed to remain and were somehow beholden to the power elite. Only those senators and congressmen who had not gone home and owed favors or were on the payroll of the bankers were present to sign the legislation. It's interesting that involved behind the scenes of the election of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt was Colonel Edward Mandelhouse, son of the Civil War Rothschild agent Thomas W. House. And Colonel Edward House represented the interests of the Rothschild Bank, originally a member of the Institute of International Affairs, formed in Paris at the Majestic Hotel in a secret meeting on May 30th of 1919. Its American branch was formed on July 29th, 1921, and is now known as, guess what, the Council for Foreign Relations. But let's move on and see how this charade continues. The Federal Reserve Act was simply a way to pacify the American voters. They'd been crying out for a banking reform and held scores of elections, alternating one set of politicians for another, only to find themselves with the same programs and getting deeper in debt. It's interesting, a prominent congressman at the time, the father of the famous Lindbergh, this is Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., had complained at the time there's a common practice of congressmen to make the title of acts promise a right, but in the body or text of the acts to rob the people of what is promised in the title. Lindbergh pointed out that the government office holders understood that by joining with the banking interests to exploit the people, their re-election is more certain than if they serve the people who elect them. By joining the exploiters their campaign expenses are paid, the support of the machines and the capital press is assured, and if by chance they should lose, they're appointed to the same office that should suit them equally or better. The same phenomenon is visible today. You notice that the same cast of characters emerge in key positions whether the nation votes Democratic or Republican. Both sides have appear to have sold out. To give you an example, the North American Trade Agreement, or even better, the GATT agreement, both of which were called agreements to avoid requiring the two-thirds majority of the Senate that the Constitution provides. And if you have internet, you know the day after they're passed, they're listed among treaties. Why weren't they called treaties up front? Because they wouldn't have passed. They only passed with a bare majority. Even Woodrow Wilson felt that he'd made a terrible mistake at signing the Federal Reserve Act. He later wrote, quote, get this, some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. How does it work? The Federal Reserve is nothing more than a group of private banks which charge interest on money that never existed prior. The government prints $1 billion worth of interest-bearing U.S. government bonds, takes them to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve accepts them and places $1 billion in a checking account that the government then writes checks on for a total of $1 billion. Question, where was the $1 billion before they touched the computer to make that entry? It didn't exist. We allow this private banking system to create money out of absolutely nothing and then loan it to our government and charge interest on it forever. The bank collects interest on the government's own money. Now, this is a slightly simplified but very accurate summary of a fairly complex flowchart, but that's the net of it. A communique from the Rothschild Investment House in England to its associate in New York remarked, quote, the few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint. Now, the privately owned Federal Reserve is now the nation's largest creditor. By the way, the interest payments received on each year account for over half of what the American people pay in federal income tax. Over $1 billion a day for the interest on the debt. The principal shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the Rothschild Bank of England, the Rothschild Bank of Berlin, the Warburg Banks of Hamburg and Amsterdam, the Lazard Brothers Banks of Paris, Israel Moses Sif Banks of Italy, Chase Manhattan Bank of New York, Lehman Brothers of New York, Kuhn Loeb of New York, and Goldman Sachs of New York. This profitable charade has been going on for 81 years. We heard mentioned earlier today the Monetary Control Act of 1980, that the power transfer by that act was expanded, which gave the Federal Reserve System control over all depository institutions, whether or not the banks were members of the so-called Federal Reserve System. This act also, among other things, gave the Federal Reserve the power to use the debt of foreign nations as collateral for the printing of Federal Reserve notes. What that means is now they can saddle American taxpayers with the foreign debts. This unseen ruling class enjoys imperial wealth. They know what they want, and they know how to obtain it, and one of the ultimate luxuries in life is privacy. The real power is to remain invisible. Now, isn't somebody screaming? They have been. Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, as early as December 15th of 1931, proclaimed as follows, quote, "The Federal Reserve Board and its banks are the duly appointed agents of the foreign central banks of issue, and they are more concerned with their foreign customer than they are with the people of the United States. The only thing that is American about the Federal Reserve Board and banks is the money they use." On Friday, June 10th, 1932, McFadden again pleaded his case. "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. Some people think that the Federal Reserve Banks are the United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers, foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers, the rich and predatory moneylenders, and so on. In that dark crew of financial pirates are those who would cut a man's throat to get a dollar out of his pocket. There are those who send money into the states to buy votes to control our legislation, and there are those who maintain an international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us and wheedling us into granting of new concessions which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion the gigantic train of crime." And we can go on about this. But I've got some other more startling disclosures to make, so let me skip ahead a little bit. Thomas Jefferson pointed out, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a money aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. That issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the government to whom it properly belongs." Which brings me to President John F. Kennedy, who planned to exterminate the Federal Reserve System and to ultimately to eliminate the national debt, as Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln had attempted in their days earlier. In 1963, by presidential order of John F. Kennedy, Executive Order 11 and also 110, the United States Treasury began printing over $4 billion worth of United States notes to replace Federal Reserve notes. When a sufficient supply of these entered circulation, the Federal Reserve notes and the system could be declared obsolete. This would end the control of the international bankers over the U.S. government and the American people. Some of these bills are still in circulation. Keep an eye on them. If you see it, they are in $1, $2, and $5 denominations. Look on your dollar bills, watch for a red seal. On the black and white side, there's a seal on the right side, typically green on your normal Federal Reserve notes. On a United States notes, there's a red seal, and if you look closely, it says not Federal Reserve note, it says United States note. And Douglas Dillon's signature appears as Secretary of Treasury. The reverse side, the green side, is identical to your regular dollar bill. There are $4 billion of these in circulation. Watch for them. I forgot to bring them. I have a sequentially numbered dozen of these. And among money hobbyists, you are probably aware of all of this. But it's interesting, a few months after putting this plan into effect, John F. Kennedy was professionally assassinated in Dealey Plaza by four rifle teams. 3 direct teams and 1 diversionary team. We now know the names of the members. And what's amazing is not the professional assassination. Anybody with the money and the connections could pull that off. The real mystery is the cover-up. Few Americans realize even to this day that a coup d'etat was engineered to save the system. And the astonishing thing, of course, is the resources that went into the cover-up. because it involved participation at the highest levels of our government. But the trail of blood continues. In the 70s and 80s, Congressman Larry P. McDonald spearheaded efforts to expose the hidden holdings and intentions of the international money interests. The Federal Reserve has never been audited, and everyone that has pursued to have it audited has been murdered. Congressman Larry P. McDonald was killed on August 31st, 1983. Senator John Hines and former Senator John Tower had served powerful banking and finance committees and were outspoken critics of the Federal Reserve and the Eastern establishment. On April 4th of 1991, Senator John Hines was killed in a plane crash near Philadelphia. On the next day, April 5th of 1991, former Senator John Tower was killed in a plane crash. The coincidences seem to mount, don't they? What's amazing about this, of course, is that you find virtually a media blackout. What amazes me about many of the issues we're going to talk about isn't just the conspirators. What's amazing is you cannot get the participation of the establishment media to deal with any of these issues, and yet the publications are available, and anyone that does a little bit of homework, to most of you who have done some homework, all of this is old news. But I've gone through this rather, as I do all of this, Otto von Habsburg's a remark still echoes in my ears: the concentration of power in America is frightening. But I'd like to shift to a little more modern issue. On July 20th of 1993, White House Deputy Counsel Vincent W. Foster was murdered, and the ensuing cover-up by the powers that be in Washington continued to be aided and abetted by the establishment press. But little by little, more and more bits of information continue to leak into the public community. We now understand that he was under investigation for espionage. Apparently, a lengthy investigation by more than a dozen sources with connections to the global intelligence community have confirmed a shocking story of money laundering and espionage connected with the highest levels of the White House. Foster's first indication of trouble was when he discovered that his coded bank account at Banca della Svizzera Italiana in Chiasso, Switzerland, had been surreptitiously emptied of $2.73 million that he'd stashed away. And he's further shocked when he discovered that it had been transferred to the U.S. Treasury. The CIA had Foster under serious investigation, but someone in the White House tipped him off. He then, according to credit card records, canceled a 2-day round-trip TLBA and Swiss Air tickets to Geneva he'd purchased on his American Express card through the White House travel office on the 1st of July. And less than 3 weeks later, his body was found with remarkably clumsy arrangements to suggest a suicide. For months, a cadre of CIA computer hackers armed with a Cray supercomputer had been monitoring Foster's Swiss bank account. They had located it while monitoring money flows, secretly snooping through the electronic files of Israel's Mossad. Foster was just one of the first of scores of high-level U.S. political figures to have secret Swiss bank accounts looted of their illicit funds. Over the past 2 years, over $2 billion has been swept out of offshore bank accounts belonging to people connected with the U.S. government, with hardly a peep from either the victims or the banks involved. This adds an additional dimension to the determined efforts to dismiss Foster's affair as a simple suicide. But I'm just beginning. Foster is now suspected of being an invaluable double agent with access to high-level political information, sensitive code, encryption, and transmission secrets. He also apparently was a behind-the-scenes manager of a key support company that's involved in one of the biggest, most secretive spy efforts on record: the silent surveillance of banking transactions both here and abroad. And if you have a Swiss bank account, you'll be very interested in the following. These bank snooping efforts began in earnest soon after Reagan became president in 1981. The initial aim was to track money behind the international terrorist groups. With traffic of over $1 trillion a day through New York, monitoring this kind of cash flow around the world is a gigantic undertaking. But using supercomputers, advanced electronic eavesdropping techniques, reconnaissance satellites, and van-installed special equipment, this all started and became a joint effort of a number of intelligence agencies, not in the U.S. but abroad. The network included wiretapping, special chips in certain hardware, and on it goes. In this story, you'll discover a software system called PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S. It was developed for the United States government. The PROMIS is an acronym built from Prosecutors Management Information System. Originally, it was designed to manage criminal information. But it was easily adaptable to track anything, including complex monetary transactions. This brings me to a company that you will be hearing about. If you haven't heard about, you'll probably be hearing about a Washington corporation called Inslaw, I-N-S-L-A-W, Inslaw Incorporated. They originally developed this software, and they sold management software to courts and related justice agencies, to the insurance industry, and several large law firms. Its principal asset was this highly sophisticated computer software system called PROMIS. In 1982, Inslaw received a $10 million contract from the Department of Justice to install this in the office of 42 U.S. attorneys. The government very quickly failed to pay on the contract. They deliberately drove Inslaw into bankruptcy and absconded with the software. The bankruptcy judge, George Basin, acknowledged that the government stole the PROMIS software by trickery, fraud, and deceit. Basin lived to regret his ruling when his reappointment was denied, and he was replaced by one of the Justice Department lawyers that had argued the Inslaw case, and no surprise, shortly the decision was reversed on technical grounds. And frankly, if it wasn't for the diligence of the owners of Inslaw in trying to pursue their just interests, we wouldn't have found out the rest of the story, and the injustice to Inslaw is just the tip of the iceberg. After several congressional investigations concluded the wrongdoing by the Justice Department, a Nicholas Bua, B-U-A, Bua, was appointed to investigate the Inslaw scandal. In June of 1993, the Bua report was released, ostensibly clearing the Justice Department officials from any wrongdoing, but now is increasingly regarded as a superficial whitewash. I'll come back to the Bua report in a minute. Meanwhile, let's get back and take a look at the software. The PROMIS software was modified to include a secret trapdoor which permitted surreptitious monitoring of the databases using it. If you've seen the recent movie The Net, you get a flavor of the kind of thing that's suggested here. The modifications, incidentally, involved a company called Hadron Incorporated that I was on the board of. I confess that to you, although at the time we had no involvement with this, to my knowledge. The software was subsequently sold to the intelligence agencies in the Middle East. PROMIS has ultimately been sold by various routes to numerous major world banks for use in their wire transfer rooms to track the blizzard of numbers, authorization codes, and confirmations required for each wire transaction. Since it was the dominant tracking software available, and because the United States government leaned on banks abroad in order to enhance their surveillance efforts, it soon became the international standard. The installation and support of PROMIS involved a small firm called Systematics Incorporated in Little Rock, Arkansas, funded and controlled by an Arkansas billionaire by the name of Jack Stevens. Vince Foster was one of Stevens' trusted dealmakers in the Rose Law Firm, where he was partner with Hillary Clinton, Webster Hubbell, and William Kennedy, whose father was on a Systematics director. In the late 1970s, Vince Foster apparently is one of the silent overseer of Systematics of the intelligence community. As you know, the largest agency is an agency that goes by the initials NSA, which some people say stands for no such agency. And other people say it stands for not secret anymore. More commonly known as the National Security Agency. It's the largest of our 7 intelligence agencies. Billions of dollars move around in black accounts. That's not a racial term, it's a term used for the covert community, for buying and selling arms, laundering drug money, and other clandestine activities. As an outsourced supplier of data processing, Systematics was used to help manage the covert money flow. At the end of every day, disguised routine bank-to-bank balancing transactions would be out of visibility of bank regulators and often the banks themselves. Now, Systematics' unique position may also explain why Jack Stevens tried to take over Washington-based Financial General Bank Shares, FGB, in 1978 on behalf of BCCI. And I won't get into all that here, but there's more important places to spend our time. But according to a lawsuit filed by the Securities Exchange Commission, Stevens had insisted upon having Systematics hired to take over all of FGB's data processing. Now we understand why. Anyway, when Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992, he brought Foster, Hubble, Kennedy to the White House staff, and Systematic's foreign business flourished. It announced data processing deals with major banks in Moscow, Macau, Singapore, Malaysia, Pakistan, Trinidad, and on it goes. Even domestic giants like Citibank and others signed big data processing deals. In fact, industry specialists like Wayne Madsen, who wrote the famous book, The Puzzle Palace, points out that it's inconceivable that any U.S. company could be involved in these transactions without deep participation by NSA and the other intelligence community involvement. Now, in 1993, the Bureau report was released, ostensibly clearing the Justice Department officials from any wrongdoing, but is now increasingly regarded as a superficial whitewash. On July 12th of 1993, Inslaw submitted a 90-page rebuttal of the Bureau report to Associate Attorney General Webb Hubbell, offering evidence that the Bureau report was false. Inslaw didn't realize at the time that Hubbell and Foster were both linked through covert operations to two Arkansas companies, Parkometer and Systematics. And their ultimate frustration now, the Inslaw people have put the Bureau report on internet. You can read it yourself. It's all on there. Paul Wiltshire, a Washington attorney investigating the Inslaw scandal, wrote Attorney General Janet Reno a 105-page letter describing the evidence he had concerning the Inslaw scandals. The first page of the letter read in part, quote, "The lives of key participants and other witnesses and even myself are now in grave danger as a result of my passing this information on to you. If you let this information fall into the hands of the wrong persons, some or all of those who know the truth could well be silenced in the very near future." A few days later, 8 days after the Bureau draft, on July 20th of 1993, Vince Foster was found murdered in Fort Marcy Park. 3 days later, July 23rd, Paul Wiltshire was found murdered in his apartment. A number of mysterious deaths, all with apparent links to Inslaw and Vince Foster, have occurred, most of them the day before key evidence was scheduled to be given. Alfred Alvarez and two friends opposing STEP's incident, the software modifications, were murdered in July of 1981. Paul Maraska started to expose the CIA activities, was found murdered in January of 1982. Larry Gurin, private investigator pursuing the information concerning the Inslaw case, was found dead in Mason County, Washington in February of 1987. David Meyer, San Francisco attorney seeking to expose links between the Justice Department, CIA, and Iran-Contra, was shot the day before a key court date, February 6, 1989. Dexter Jacobson, attorney, August 14, 1990, prior to a scheduled FBI meeting. Gary Ray Pennell, attorney, February 11, 1981, just prior to an FBI meeting. Alan D. Standorf, an electronic intelligence employee of the National Security Agency, and a key source to Danny Casolaro, I'll come back to him in a minute, was found in the back seat of his car at Washington National Airport, January 31, 1991. David Eisman, attorney, April 1991, shot to death 24 hours before scheduled meetings in which he was to receive key evidence of corruption by Justice Department officials. Alan May, found dead in a San Francisco home under suspicious circumstances, June 19, 1991. Tommy Burkett, after a meeting with Casolaro, I'll come to him next, found shot in the bedroom of his parents' home in Hendon, Virginia, 1991. Danny Casolaro, a lot of trails go back to him. Investigating the Inslaw situation with possible links to BCCI, CIA, and related matters, told his brother, quote, "If there was an accident and he died, don't believe it." On August 10th, 1991, Casolaro received sensitive documents at the parking lot of the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, Virginia. He had confided into a number of confidants that he had finally broken the Inslaw case after a year-long, full-time investigation. The next day, Casolaro was found murdered in his hotel room, his briefcase and notes missing. We also understand that an NSA employee was also in the room and murdered, but his body was removed from the scene. Ian Spiro, assisting the collection of documents to be presented at the federal grand jury in connection with Inslaw. His wife, Gail Spiro, and their 3 children, shot in their home, Rancho Santa Fe, California, found on November 1st, 1992. 3 days later, the husband's found in the front seat of his Ford Explorer in the remote desert. Jose Aguilar, a workman occasionally involved with their home, was also found shot November 14th, 1992. Valley Delahunty disappears on August 18th, 1992. On April 13th of 1994, her skeletal remains are discovered in Lake Bay, Washington. Peter Sandvigen, former CIA operative assisting in evidence against the Justice Department, found dead December 2nd, 1992. And on it goes. Sherman Skolnick, who is a plaintiff with the citizens group in Chicago called the Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts, has filed a lawsuit against Buell And he maintains that 40 witnesses have been murdered by agents of the Department of Justice. Last fall, Congressman Jack Brooks, Democrat, Texas, Charlie Rose, Democrat, North Carolina, tried to enact a bill that would force an investigation of the Justice Department and the death of Danny Casolaro and the Inslaw scandal. On September 27th of 1994, Attorney General Janet Reno issued a report stating that there was no scandal, no need for independent counsel or further investigation. And October 7th, the resolution was defeated. But the mysteries multiply. If Foster knew that the U.S. was spying on foreign banks, why would he let himself be caught red-handed? Either he felt that there was that as an insider he had some protection, or he was a bagman for somebody he was confident could cover him. Sources in the CIA indicate that Foster was not the only one in the White House under suspicion for peddling state secrets. And who was he bagman for? Why, according to two separate sources, were the documents relating to systematics among those that were taken from Foster's office immediately after Foster's death? We understand that Webb Hubbell has delivered those documents to Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr. Let's hope the truth will come out. I've been told that Kenneth Starr is a Christian, and I encourage all of us to put him at the head of our prayer list. The pressure on him's got to be gigantic. On July 20th, 1993, about 1 p.m., Vince Foster left his office at White House and said that he would return later at 5:45 p.m. His body was found in Fort Marcy Park. And most of the experts indicate there's evidence had been moved at least 4 times. But the more one learns the details, the stranger it becomes. Why was there no blood on the ground, no bone fragments or brain tissue? Why were rug fibers all over his clothes? Why was there no dust on his shoes despite the long dirt path to get to where he was? There are over 40 discrepancies in the FBI account that make a suicide verdict virtually facetious. A cover-up of immense proportions are again taking place for reasons of national security, I'm sure. You might be interested to know that the main money interests behind Clinton's successful campaign, namely Jack Stevens and Don Tyson, both of Clinton Chronicles fame, are the major supporters of a guy by the name of Bob Dole. It seems that both sides of the aisle are just one happy family. Now the good news is there are a few media picking this up. We owe an incredible debt to Christopher Ruddy, working full-time for the Pittsburgh Tribune. Most of what you want to find out, if you want to find out what's going on, you read the foreign press, the London Telegraph, and others. There's much of what I've shared with you today, most of it is available in a magazine called Media Bypass that broke these stories just a few weeks ago. So the stories are starting to leak out both with these kinds of publications and internet. You can find most of these things on the network. I haven't bothered to discuss Oklahoma City. Most of you, I think, are following that. Some of the experts, the most knowledgeable people I know, are convinced, doesn't mean they're right, but they're convinced that it was an inside job by the U.S. government. There are many people that believe that Tim McVeigh may be the Lee Harvey Oswald of the 90s. Well, we'll see. The real issue here, to me, is issue of truth. We live in a country that we consider a free society, and yet our media, our press, are participating in the cover-up. Jack Davidson, publishing Strategic Investing, has highlighted much of this over the last couple of years, hit with a lawsuit that was finally thrown out of federal court a few weeks ago, but he had to spend the last couple of years defending it, a contrived lawsuit because he was one of the ones ringing the bell about what's going on. There's a major journalistic war going on between the London Telegraph and the Washington Post, accusing the Washington Post of not just spiking the truth, but deliberately publishing information they knew was not true to help hide these stories. Where is the press when you need them? Their mandate before our society is to tell the voters the truth, and yet Don Hewitt, the executive director of CBS 60 Minutes, can brag on video that they successfully hid the truth from the U.S. public in order to get Clinton through the New Hampshire primary. If you haven't seen that, the Clinton Chronicles tape is one example. The videos, these hand-to-hand videos that were hand-carried to every senator and congressman, by the way, that got Robert Fiske replaced with Kenneth Starr as a special prosecutor, are a gigantic step in the right direction, but where's the media when you need them? And more to the point, what's going on? Is it true? Is Skolnick and these other people's accusations true? Is the present Department of Justice from the top down corrupt? Is the corruption so widespread on both sides of the legislative aisle that there's little chance of it being exposed? There are many people, the most knowledgeable people I know in Washington, that believe it's so widespread and so deep that both sides have a strong interest to have this all covered up. And if that's true, it's over. Is the reason that we see all these preparations for a police state, the newsletters are full of them, that are going on, everybody assumes that all these preparations that our current administration is taking to increase the police power of the federal government, preparations for a one world government. Indeed, ultimately they may be, but maybe there's a more immediate pragmatic answer. Maybe the economic upheavals that some of the experts are seeing coming very soon may be going to precipitate the kind of civil unrest that may require some muscle to maintain order in this country. Is the free society that you and I have enjoyed these many decades over? Is it just a charade, a facade? Whether you look at the banking situation or whether you look at the apparent corruption in the judicial process, it is frightening. I personally think that over the next few weeks, few months, whatever, either the Vince Foster scandals and all the things related to Inslaw and all this are going to surface and get exposure, or they won't. They'll be covered up, laughed out, character assassination and other kinds of assassinations continuing to prevent the real truth from coming out. If that's true, it's over. I personally view many of these things as being an indicator. Now, you're going to hear many other talks during this conference. One of the questions you're going to obviously ask, my goodness, Chuck, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? Well, one of the things I strongly urge you to do is learn your Bible. Learn your Bible. Secondly, I'm also going to encourage every one of you to start developing your sources of information. Anyone that stares at the tube at the 10 o'clock news with ABC, NBC, CBS, or CNN is going to get spoon-fed the same kind of managed rhetoric that the powers that are in process want you to have. And yet if you look around the world anywhere else, you realize it's managed and deceitful, either by incompetence or by bias or by something much more sinister. In any case, develop your sources of information. Let me give you the good news. The monopoly on the news in this country is broken, thanks to talk radio, thanks to the faxes and modems. And thanks to the foreign press. Some of the foreign press includes the most reputable papers in the world for centuries. Goes way back. And we used to have some like that in this country. Back about 15 years ago, there were 2,200 independent newspapers in the United States. Today, they're all owned by less than 50 families. So the venerated New York Times, Washington Post used to be pillars of truth, and yet they're a joke in recent years for many, many reasons by anyone that follows this and pays attention. I might call your attention that our September newsletter has an article on summarizing the Vince Foster story. It also has a summary article on the media, and it also has a genealogy of the Antichrist you might find provocative. But the monopoly is being broken not only by talk radio, but by foreign publications, but internet. If you're computer literate, I encourage you to find out about internet. Use it. People say, well, there's pornography on it. Only if you look for it. Secondly, the day that pornography is not there is when I worry. I applaud it, because I applaud the freedom to have whatever someone says available, because I'm desperately anxious for the truth to be available. The minute you start having censors of that kind, you've got somebody else managing what can come through your pipe. And you're responsible for what you watch, not the source. That's a separate kind of a problem. I'll give you one example. A few months ago, we had one of the most exciting decisions from the Supreme Court handed down. If you know the story of Alfonso Lopez, 12th grader, Texas, carried a gun to school, arrested under Texas law, Fed stepped in, and the Texas thing was dropped, and the Feds charged him under federal law. And he was indicted and convicted in court. He appealed to the Supreme Court. And in a landmark decision, which you have to read to believe, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government has no authority over the schools. Praise God. And you read that decision, it opens up by pointing out that the rights of the federal government are specific and enumerated. The rights of the states are open and not numerable. And he says, and it says, down this path we've gone so far, but further we will not go. And it nailed it. And this decision is written so broad that any attorney worth his salt should be able to use that for years. It's the most refreshing decision that I've noticed in 60 years. But what's interesting about this, I heard about this. I turned to Colin, my partner, and I said, what do you know about this? He says, just a minute. And 60 seconds later, he hands the text of the decision, puts it on my desk. Where'd you get this? Oh, it's on the net. You can find out what the schedule is tomorrow of the White House. You can find out the text of the bills that are being considered. You can find out what's going on. There are services that monitor all the intelligence agencies of the world. Not the covert stuff, obviously, but the point is, it's amazing what is available on the net. And if you're set up right, it's essentially free. And the internet, the exciting thing, the technology is such that it was designed to survive a nuclear blast, which means it's not controllable. It's self-healing, self-correcting. It's not controllable. It straddles borders. And we believe that it's going to be the media of the underground church, should that be necessary, and we're trying to position ourselves to be not only effective on it, but to be able to straddle borders ourselves should some aggressive administrators or this administration even continue on the path it started in trying to stamp out Christianity in the United States. We have more to talk about. You're going to ask, what do I do about this? Candidly, our basic answer is embodied in what we call the vortex strategy. You can chase that down, but we'll also be talking on this subject tomorrow morning.